welcome to today's session, Brain Functioning and Learning, What You Need to Know to Energize Your Training with Bob Lucas. Before we begin this webinar, actually, I'd like to take a moment to go over the interactive features of the virtual conference room that we're all in. On the upper left corner of your screen, you'll see a mute button with a gray down arrow. This is how you can adjust your audio if you can't hear me comfortably or at any time lose your audio during the webinar. You can also interact with the group by doing things such as raising your hand, saying yes, saying no, smile, and clap by clicking on the emoticons located on the top left corner of the screen. Please feel free to try that out right now. If you have any questions for the presenters during the presentation, please feel free to send a message in the text chat and we'll respond at the appropriate times. If you need technical support, please call our technical support hotline at 877-799-7222. That number again is 877-799-7222. I'll also type that in the chat for everyone. And of course, the recording and the slides will be distributed after the event is over, so there is no need to take notes. Alrighty, let's begin. I'd like to introduce you to our speaker for today, Bob Lucas. Bob is a internationally known author, and sorry guys, I just lost my notes here. Bob Lucas is an internationally known author and learning and performance expert who specializes in workplace performance-based training and consulting services. He has 4 decades of experience in human resources development, management, and customer service in a variety of organizational environments, and was the 1995 and 2011 president of the Central Florida chapter of the American Society for Training and Development, or ASTD. Alrighty, Bob, I'm going to turn it all over to you.
Well, thank you, Henry. Appreciate that. Welcome, everyone, to the webinar. I appreciate your taking your time to sign on for this. I know that as trainers and adult learners and educators and whatever else you're doing, you often have more to do than you have time. So I certainly appreciate the effort for you to take out an hour of your time to partake in this event. And hopefully you'll find it useful for yourself. I want to point out on the slide that you see on the screen my web address and my blog address. Please feel free to use those as resources. There are hundreds of articles on both of those, as well as other resources on my website that you might find useful. As Henry said, I'm an author. I've written 33 books, 7 of them on brain-based learning, creative training, and training design over the last 45 years. And I'd hope you'd look at those as a resource as well. Most of them are available through Amazon, and you can find out information about them on my website. I think you'll find that a lot of what we're talking about today is included in those books, but you'll also find a lot more ideas and strategies and some of the information related to the research. Since I only have an hour here, I really don't have time to go in depth on a lot of the research portion of it, but you'll find that in those areas. And again, as you heard, I've been involved in training for over 4 decades. So in that period, as many of you have, I've come across the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to learning. And it's always a challenge to find ways to help learners, especially adult learners, gain the most from our sessions. So what I'd like to do today, and my goal for you, is to share some of what I've learned related to brain-based learning strategies, get my mouth working here, and some of the techniques that I've researched, used, written about for the last 4 decades plus, and hopefully you'll find some value in them as well. Because one of the things I've found over the years is that while the concepts of brain-based learning aren't new in some instances, a lot of you may not have been exposed to them. And so I want to share some of that information with you and maybe a little bit of the research behind the concepts so that you'll understand the value of applying some of the strategies that are out there related to brain-based learning in your own sessions, so that your learners will be able to better gain, retain, recall, and use what you share with them. Because that's our ultimate goal as trainers and educators, is to help people be better at what they do and walk out of the room with things they can immediately apply on the job. And as most of you may know, the concepts of brain-based learning are tied intricately into accelerated and experiential learning. Some of you may have heard it as active learning. And there are lots of resources out there. There are hundreds of books and articles. Certainly the ATD, which is the formal ASTD organization, has a variety of resources that you might want to tap into if you haven't done that. And those of you who aren't members of the national or your local chapters, I encourage you to get involved in those, because speakers come in and talk on various topics related to what we're going to share today, but also other things that can help you be better at what you are in relation to training adults and sharing adult information. So let's go back and talk about where I got started very briefly. My interest in brain-based learning started almost 3+ decades ago. For those of you who were around training at the time, you may remember that President George W. Bush designated the 1990s as the decade of the brain. And that's because they pumped millions of dollars, federal dollars, into brain research for physicians and brain researchers to try to figure out how the brain works and what works when stimuli such as visual or auditory or tactile stimulus is provided to someone who's hooked up to some of the machinery that they have available today to look inside the brain, the PET scans, the MRIs, and other types of non-invasive equipment that is used to take a snapshot, if you will, actively in the brain and see what happens when somebody sees an image or hears a sound. And the wonderful thing about that research that they've been doing for decades is that it gives us as trainers and adult educators more tools to help improve what we share and how we share it with our learners. And that's because all the information that they've gathered from their research can be extrapolated and pointed in different directions related to how adults and children also learn. And many school systems, as some of you know if you're parents, have actually adopted brain-based curriculums in their districts to help their children learn more effectively. And they've done everything from modifying lighting to creating environments and classrooms that are more interactive and more visually and auditorily stimulating. They use more advanced equipment to help share information with their students, and they certainly engage their students more than they used to when many of us, myself included obviously, sat in a room and had a teacher up front, and we were sitting in rows and they were talking at us and telling us, someday you're going to need this. Well, you all know as well as I do, and if you're familiar with Malcolm Knowles and his adult learning theory, you know that adults don't buy into that. They want to know, okay, I want to know, when am I going to be able to apply this? How am I going to be able to apply it? And they want to be able to get engaged in the learning process. And that's what brain-based learning really helps us do. By modifying the way that we develop our workshop content and our seminar concept, and the way we structure the environment and deliver information, we can potentially aid our learners into maximizing outcomes so that they're actually able to go back and put it into the use as soon as they walk out of that room. I don't know about you, but that's one of the things that I really look for when I attend a session. Can I take this information and start applying it as soon as I get out of this learning environment? How many of you have experienced that in your own learning? That's one of the things that we have an opportunity. I see a lot of hands going up. That's one of the things that we have an opportunity as trainers and adult educators to immediately help our learners do. So what I'm going to be going through today is talking about some of the interactive strategies, ways to impact your environments, to enrich them maybe, how you can readily target the major learning modalities. the visual, the auditory, the kinesthetic modalities that we gather most of our information from as adult learners, and how to more effectively engage brain neurons to help you facilitate comprehension and memory in your learners. As we go through, we'll be talking about a variety of topics, and as Henry said earlier, you'll be getting a copy of this recording so you can go back and review it and share it with others if you'd like. And in addition to that, you'll get a copy of the slides so you can sort of watch as we go through without having to take notes or do whatever else you're doing that might distract you, so that you can go back and pick out things that you might want to go back and investigate and potentially try in your own learning environment. First thing that I'd like to point out, sort of a note if you will, is it's important to remember that as we go through briefly and explore the potential of brain-based learning, like many tools and techniques and strategies we use when we train adults and we teach adults, there's no absolute guarantee that if you do A, B is going to result. That no particular approach is going to work for everyone in your learning sessions. Have you all experienced that? How many of you have found that what works for one doesn't work for all? And it's amazing to me when I get an evaluation at the end of a program sometimes. I've got 100 people in a room, and there's always one or two that said, you know, this is terrible, I didn't get it, you know, blah, blah, blah. And others are, well, this is the best thing, this is peanut butter. Oh, I want to go out and use the things that are on there. And I see somebody pointed out we're still on the introductory slide. You're correct, we are. I haven't actually gotten to the content. This is sort of the background, if you will, of where we're going with this. So please bear with me. I'll get there. So again, one of the things that we want to remember is that we can do a lot of things in the classroom to impact learning if it's done well. And it'll work for many of your people, but some people will say, you know, I don't get it, I don't like it, I don't want it, and they'll walk away and they'll look for the next best thing. It's sort of like your CEOs who go off to conferences and they come back and they're all inspired because somebody spoke about the latest, greatest book, the, you know, Who Moved My Cheese or the 1 Minute Manager or whatever the trend happens to be, and all of a sudden everybody in the organization is getting a copy and they have to read it, and then they're going to go through training on it. How many of you have experienced that? I know I certainly have, and I call that the flavor of the month. You know, next month it'll go away and something else will replace it. So let's get started by taking a look at what exactly I'm going to be sharing with you as we go through. Certainly I want to talk about what brain-based learning is, and I've sort of alluded to it a bit in my comments here. I also want to talk to you about what are you going to do with this stuff? You know, how can you apply it effectively? And as I go along, I'm going to give you a few examples. And again, please bear with me. We only have an hour to get through a lot of ideas and concepts. Please visit my websites and my blog. I have a lot of content information there that might help explain some of this further. Also, if you just go to the internet and type in any of the concepts we're talking about. If you've never done so, go type in brain-based learning for adults on the internet and you'll find dozens and dozens and dozens of resources for you that you can experiment and investigate further. I also want to talk to you about a couple of things that are important when you're designing your training programs. One of the things that I did years ago is sort of took the ADDIE model and applied brain-based learning to each element of it. And I actually turned that into one of my books on workshop designs. And one of the things that I did that for is because a lot of times people ask me in sessions, well, into the design process, when I'm going through doing an environmental scan, for example, what I'll be using in my classroom, how does this apply to that? What can I do from a brain-based learning concept? And so I'll talk about some of those things as I go through this morning. And also I want to talk about how this ties to Knowles' adult learning theory briefly, because it ties in very nicely, as you'll see. And ultimately what I want to do is help share with you the way that brain-based learning can help improve your learners' outcomes. So if that sounds okay with you, then let's get started. You see on your screen the definition of brain-based learning. And in a nutshell, basically, when you're doing brain-based learning, you're taking what researchers and brain explorers, if you will, scientists have found can actually impact the brain. And what we're doing is we're creating things, opportunities, we're creating environments, we're creating activities, we're creating things that will help your learners, again, best gain, retain, recall, and use what they learn. And this concept of brain-based learning varies depending on who's talking about it, but basically you're applying the research and trying to encourage people to apply it in a learning environment so that adult learners, specifically in our case, will walk out of the room having a better opportunity to apply what they've learned. So let's talk about that process just a bit. How does this happen? How do we take what we know about the brain and we move it into the area of reality? And a key to the successful application of this is for everybody in the learning process. You, the person who designs your materials, if it's not you, the person who is helping do the audio visual, the person who is the sponsor of your program, whether it be a supervisor or if you're an external consultant like I am, the person who's paying the bills, to help them understand how the brain best works and why you're doing what you're doing in the classroom environment. And if you can do some of that, if you can provide sort of an overview for people after you've understood it yourself, then that's going to make your learning more effective because it's going to give people an opportunity to recognize the value and the importance of it. Another thing to think about it related to the process is that the reason we are here is because there are learners connected to us. The reason I'm here today is because we've got 267 people who are interested in finding out better ways or other ways to enhance their learning environment. So it's very crucial that we never lose sight of who our purpose for being there is. It's not the person paying the bill. It's not the person who is ultimately going to hear about the training. It's the person who's actually receiving it and that is going to go back and try to use what you share with them. So the best way to make that happen is to make sure that the learning process is active. One of the things that we know from brain-based theory and some of the research we've got out there available to us is that learning is a very active process. If you build in things like challenges and ambiguity and you use creative ways of doing that and encouraging people to get engaged, you're going to be more effective as a learning dispenser, if you will. And when I talk about creative ways, I'm talking about everything. There are prompts out there related to your training topics you might use. There's music out there related to the topics you might use. There are activities by the thousands out there on the internet that are free. There are books, there are activities and articles that provide those available to you on the internet. Reach out and pull those into your learning. Don't get caught in the I've always done it that way approach because it's easier that way. I know we don't have a lot of time as trainers, but don't get caught into, well, every Monday we do orientation and our opening activity is this. Instead, go out there and pull in some new opening activities because we know from research that if you challenge your brain as a facilitator, then you're going to challenge your learners. Do you think it's possible for your learners to recognize if you really don't have a high motivation about what you're facilitating? How many of you believe that? Is that something that you've experienced yourself where the person's up there putting out information and you know they're going through a script or you know they're going through a process of just delivering the same thing they deliver every week? And that's very frustrating from a learning standpoint. I'm sure you'll agree. So one of the things we want to do is to actively engage people in the process and use different modalities and different ways of accomplishing that. Added to this is other strategies that are out there available, or are other strategies, I should say. We all probably are using problem-solving activities. Get people engaged. I'm a former drill instructor. As I tell people when they ask me how did I get started in training, my first gig, if you will, as a trainer was as a drill instructor for 3 years at Parris Island, South Carolina, training Marine recruits. And back then, we used rote memory, we used a lot of intimidation, we used all the things that are bad for learners. But, you know, to some degree, that worked in that environment. But it doesn't work in our environments now. And so I've gone 180 degrees in my thinking. Now I know about brain-based learning, and I know about how other things can apply and be used in a learning environment. So I use toys, I use props, I use manipulative items on the tables, I use color on my flip charts and my slides, as you see, I use graphic images, I use all kinds of things that will help get the concepts across to folks, because if it's not interactive and if you're not getting feedback on how the process is working, even if it's something as simple as asking a yes/no question or surveying your crowd, as I've been doing along the way here, it's very important to do those things, because brain-based research shows us that by actively engaging people as simply as having them raise their hand and lower their hand, that's a physical activity. That little movement in itself stimulates blood flow. It gets the heart pumping a little bit. And so if you're doing a lot of those kinds of activities, you're getting more brain or more oxygen through the blood pumped to the brain, which stimulates the brain neurons, which helps people stay alert and become more effective in the learning process. So again, these are just some of the simple things that we can do as a facilitator, as someone who is trying to share information in an interactive manner with our learners. And by the way, as you heard earlier, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to type them in, and Henry will shoot those over to us so we can take an opportunity to possibly address that. If it's something I'm going to be talking about later in the training and you're getting ahead of me, I'll point that out, but I'll also make sure I cover that answer. And again, you have my contact information. Please shoot me an email. It's blucas@robertwlucas.com, and I'll be happy to be a resource for you. I'll answer any questions about this content you have, and I will certainly point you in the direction of any other resources I have available that you might need help on. And I've had students in my master's programs, and I've had people in my sessions around the world ask questions. So no question is stupid. Please don't feel free, be afraid to ask it. And I will try to get you the best answer I can. And it's a freebie. So the added value, if you will, to go along with this free seminar. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple other things here related to the brain-based learning process as we move along. One of the things that brain-based learning helps people do is make new associations and form new memories. And that happens when you can relate what you're talking about and relate your activities to what they already know. And that's the benefit of doing that needs assessment we talked about earlier, because one of the things that we have an opportunity to do is share new ideas, but we want to be able to tie them into what they already know. So if they've identified in a needs assessment that they have a certain level or certain knowledge, or they're an expert in a certain area, pull that into your learning as you're facilitating, as I'm sure many of you are doing now, because that's one of the things that we know from brain research helps them form new patterns, make new connections, and ultimately create new memories and ideas that they can go out and start using. In addition to that, one of the things that I always encourage people to do is make sure everything you say or do in your learning event is related to having the goals of the session in mind. Everything you do, say, or show should be related to your learning objectives. If it's not, you're wasting time, you're not facilitating effectively, and you're probably creating frustration in the mind of your learners. They're going to walk out of there saying, well, that was a waste of time. So while you might like a joke or a story or whatever, if it has nothing to do with the content or the topic, my suggestion is leave it somewhere else and find things that do apply to what you're delivering. And make the whole session fun as part of the process. As I said, you can use sounds, you can use music, you can use toys, you can use a variety of things. So let's talk about how do you apply some of this information into your learning environment specifically. I mentioned earlier the need to do an advanced needs assessment. And I know this is a challenge sometimes. How many of you have a supervisor who knows what training we need to deliver to our learners? They don't want to waste time doing needs assessments. They don't want to waste time and money if they're an internal person and they're bringing an external consultant to do this needs assessment. We already know what the problem is. We just want you to come in and do a 30-minute session that'll fix it. Reality is, as you and I know as professionals, is not going to happen. It is not going to work. So try to do a needs assessment and try to sell that idea as quickly and as firmly as you can to whomever is engaging you to do the learning. If it's something that you're doing organizational wide, try to get as many pieces of input as you can. And some of the ways you can do that are to reach out to your folks through a questionnaire or do a telephone or face-to-face interview. Questionnaires can be simple. They don't have to be 15 pages because the longer you make it, the less input you're going to get. And try to get it from the participants as well as their supervisors. And somewhere in between, you're probably going to find the real issue. And then you'll be able to design that issue into your learning objectives so that you can address the true content. Ideally, you want to talk to people because if you can, through a focus group or a face-to-face interview or a telephone interview, that will give you the opportunity to ask additional questions if they make a comment. I know there have been many times where I've gone in to a classroom, and you probably have experienced this, and you're doing, say, customer service 101 or whatever 101, and throughout the session you've got learners saying, my boss needs to be here, they need to hear this because they don't know how to do this. And one of the things that can help is to ultimately get to the problem and to help you understand better what you need to do in the classroom. Observing on the site would be in an ideal world, great. Internal practitioners, you probably have a better chance of doing this than we external people do, but it's another source for you. You can actually see people doing things on the job. You can look at their job descriptions and then compare that to what they're doing and see what might help strengthen their performance. And ultimately, if you can't get buy-in, you can't get people to do these kinds of things, one of the things that you may want to consider doing is a mini in-class needs assessment. One of the things I do to add color to the room, to engage people as soon as they walk into that room, is to go back and think of questions that might help you gather information about your learners. I encourage you to use these on the walls, and what I do is I give an introductory sheet as people register or walk into the room, and it says basically, you know, find a seat, be comfortable, sit next to someone other than your friends because you want them to network. But I also have a thing on there, please, before the session starts, go around to the room and answer each question with a check or a number or whatever the question is asking for. And that gives you a visual record to look around at as you go through the session and tie it into your content, and also let your learners see that they or other people are like them. Either they do or don't know something. And these, again, are closed-in questions typically. It might be how many, if you're a trainer, for example, if I was doing a train-to-trainer session, it might be how many of you, or how many classes a year do you do? And it might be 0, it might be 1 to 5, 6 to 10, etc. And they go around and they put a check in that box. So that gives you an idea of the experience level you have in your room. And one of the things that as we go through and look at some of this information, you'll see is that that information can come in handy. Also, when you do your flip charts, use different colors on each one. That'll subtly introduce some color into the room, and I'll be talking about why that's important later. As an alternative to your flip charted questions, by the way, another mini needs assessment might be to use a 3x5 card or a blank piece of paper, because going back to personality styles, which we have to deal with in the classroom, one of the things that they can do is write down a comment or a question or something they want to get out of the session before they end, and they throw it in a box, and you pick those out throughout the session and address those. And if you don't get to all of them before the session's over, at the end, you can go back and look at some of those comments and questions and respond to them afterwards. Speaking of which, I see tons of questions popping in, and I love that. There's no way we're going to get to all those in this 1 hour session. So what I'm going to ask Henry to do is to forward those to me, and I'll get responses to those that are addressed to me and to the class in general, and I will get those sent out to you if that's okay. Does that work for everyone? And just put a check mark there if that works for you. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at some of the elements of your training design that you probably should take a look at if you're not already doing so. And brain-based learning, again, is so crucial from so many perspectives that I would ask you to consider how you're going to go about designing your programs. There are many different facets, as you see here. The elements of the learning environment, for example, I'm going to talk about those first, but also content reviews, because research shows that the more we experience something through our senses, the more likely we are to be able to use that information and retain that information. So let's start out by talking about some of the elements of the learning environment briefly. How many of you have walked into a room and it's dead silent, and you don't know anybody in the room, and maybe the handouts are kind of haphazardly thrown on the tables, and you just sort of find a seat and you just sit there? I don't know about you, but when I walk into that sterile type of environment, because a lot of times there's nothing on the walls, there's nothing going on to engage me mentally, I sort of am skeptical, saying, okay, what's going to happen next? I would encourage you to use some of the elements I'm going to be talking about here briefly and incorporate those into your room. And with sound, I also incorporate music into that category. And so I would suggest you have some kind of upbeat music playing as people walk into the room. If you're going to use music, you may want to try to find songs that relate to your topic. For example, a number of years ago, I did a session on time management, and it's amazing how many songs are out there about time going back to the 60s or earlier. You can have those playing throughout the day, at the beginning of the session, during breaks, during lunch, whatever, and that sort of reinforces the concept of time in that instance. So look for things that relate to personal relationships, if you're talking about interpersonal communication, or any other topic you have. See if you can find things specific to that. If not, find things that are upbeat that will address the topic you're having, depending on the topic. Now, obviously, if you're talking about layoffs and things like that, this probably isn't something you want to do. But if it's a topic on a people skill type program, incorporate those things in there. Get people engaged. Have them interacting. When I told you earlier about the sheet I give them, I have them walk in and I tell them to sit next to somebody they don't know, because you don't want them sitting there chit-chatting with their friends. You want them to learn other ideas and be exposed to other people and network. So give them an opportunity to start that networking right up front. Have the music in the background, have them talking, and ultimately, as you're going through the day, have them engaged in activities where they're discussing things, brainstorming, problem solving, etc. Related to that is lighting. Again, a number of research studies have been. But before I go any further, though, let me point out a research study that you may want to take a look at. Neurologists found out years ago. They did there was an article back in the Nature Neuroscience magazine back in 2001, and it was by two authors, Maess, and the last name of the second person is Koelsch. So that's Maess and Koelsch. Those two folks basically looked at how music and language tie together, and they found out, looking at the research, that the same part of the brain that processes linguistic or communication also processes music. So a lot of times the way that you order the things that you're providing from a vocal standpoint helps people learn. And if you can tie it to a sound, a musical sound, a song or whatever, background music, instrumental, By the way, if you're going to use music, it's better to use instrumental if they're doing reflective activities or they're thinking about something or they're relaxing, because that helps bring the brain patterns down a bit. And again, there's lots of books out there. There's 2 books specifically that might help you related to sound and music. One of those is Training with a Beat, which is by Lynn Milbauer. Training with a Beat is one of them. And the second one is Top Tunes for Teaching by Eric Jensen. And both of those books, Training with a Beat and Top Tunes for Teaching, have discussion about why it's important to use music and ties to brain-based learning, but it also goes back and provides information on the types of music you could use, including song titles they recommend. So let's go to the second environmental element, which is lighting. Research has been done by NASA and other organizations that deal with lighting, and they found that the closer you can get lighting to the natural light, the more it's going to stimulate the brain, the more it's going to help reinforce what's happening in the environment. Now, obviously, you don't want distractions, so if you've got blinds in your room, you might want to close those to a portion where the light comes through, but people can't look out. Best thing is turn people away from windows, face them towards a wall or the front of the room where they can't be looking out the window and getting distracted. But you don't want shadows cast on your learning aids, and you don't want glares coming in that would distract your learners, but you do want as much natural lighting as possible. Colors is another excellent way, based on research that we know, to stimulate brain neurons. You can use color in so many different ways. You can use them on slides like I'm doing, or flip charts using different colors. Ideally, if you're going to use colors on those types of training aids, use one color throughout. Dark colors are usually better than pastels. Use those to highlight, or for graphics if you want to highlight and add color to them. But use dark colors, blacks, navy blues, forest greens, those kinds of things. Stay away from reds, because people who are colorblind like I am, at a distance that starts to run together and it's difficult to see. Same thing with pastels. You can't see them from a distance, so stay away from those kinds of colors, except for highlights. But introduce color in your room. I use toys of different colors. For example, when I do brain-based learning seminars and workshops for ATD groups and other groups, I will put little brains, erasers on tables, different colors. So if I know I have 20 people in a room, I have 20 erasers, but they're divided by 5. So I have 5 yellow, 5 blue, 5 red, 5 green. And when I get ready to break people into a group, I tell them if they've got a specific color to go to a different corner of the room, and now you have your groups already separated without having to go through the cumbersome process of count off 1 to 5, etc., which people always mess up in my experience. And so again, you can add colors that way. Add manipulative toys on the table that your kinesthetic learners can play with as they process and think. These are ways to add color. Aromas have also been found to be very important as part of what you do. And there are 2 smells specifically that people probably use and they don't even know the value of it. According to brain researchers, peppermint and citrus, like oranges, stimulate brain neurons. They kind of perk you up. It's like a hit. So introduce those into your room. Sometimes you go to training sessions and people have peppermint candy on the tables. Those are often used because, number one, they're cheaper than the other more expensive chocolates and such, but they also have a sort of subliminal effect in that when someone pops one in their mouth, not only do they get that hit of smell, but people around them smell it too. So you might introduce those, and instead of giving cookies and heavy stuff for breaks in the afternoon or in the morning, mid-morning, throw out some fresh fruit, throw out some oranges, so when cut them into squares, make it easy for people to eat, and as somebody bites into it, they get that burst of aroma. Some other things that you may want to take a look at is movement and motion. Get people moving. There's a book called Brain Gym, B-R-A-I-N Gym, G-Y-M, and it's primarily for teachers teaching children, but you can pull out quick activities and use them in adult learning environments as well. And again, by getting people to move up and down, and you can do that with your questions and answer sessions too. Get people to stand up if they've ever heard such and such, or if they agree with such and such, then sit down. And again, you're having people move, which stimulates the oxygen flow to the brain, perks up the brain. This is a big area here that we've heard about before, which is nutrition. And many people use the wrong foods. And again, I don't have time to go into a lot of detail on this, but if you visit my blog, there's an article on nutrition, also in some of my books on brain-based learning, the creative trainer, the designing workshop essentials. Those have specific items you can use for nutrition. Bottom line is stay away from heavy foods like pastas and carbohydrates and those type things. Use a lot of fruits, a lot of water, keep them hydrated. Those type things will help stimulate the brain. Similarly with your foods, if you're going to have lunch or refreshments or breakfast, give things that will stimulate them. Give them fresh vegetables. Give them things other than heavy candy snacks and sugar that's going to give them a quick burst, but then they're going to fall down on you. Look at also how you arrange your furniture, because we know that if you're going to have interaction, you want people facing one another. So my preferred setup is either round tables or as an alternative U shape. So look at how you've got your people sitting. Now, obviously, if you're doing technical training, there's going to be a challenge because you want to be able to get in behind them and see what they're doing. So you have to sort of design your room so you can see all tables at the same time, and ideally get an assistant instructor in there to help you. And think about where you're putting your equipment too, because that's another issue that we sometimes forget about. You don't want glares or shadows on your flip charts. You don't want light shining on your slides. And you want to use things that are effective. If you don't need it, don't put it in a room because people are going to wonder why it's there. So with that in mind, let's talk quickly about content reviews, because we know from research that the more times people see, hear, taste, touch, and feel things, the more likely they are to gain, retain, recall, and use it. And I use something called interim reviews, and these can be something such as a Q&A where I ask questions about the content I've covered, or it can be a small group activity. And you can use a lot of color and a lot of activity. Make these things fun. For example, you see some Easter eggs there on the screen. I use those. I put little strips of paper in it that have key concepts taught up to that section in the learning environment. And the way I use that is I pass them around. People pick one out, and after everyone has one, I ask people to volunteer to stand and read what they have inside their egg. And then someone else volunteers to define it or to explain it or tell how they might use it in their learning environment. And by this way, I'm engaging people. I'm getting movement involved. I've got color with the eggs. I've got sound by people talking. So I'm bringing in a lot of the elements we talked about so far into what we're doing as far as an activity. And I do these, depending on how the length of the program, I do these every 18 to 20 minutes, because that's what researchers have found is the optimum time for most adults to hold their attention. And I apologize for us having to do this for an hour this way, because I know some of you are zoning out probably at this point with information overload. But again, we're just trying to introduce some ideas that maybe you can go back and start using. And ultimately, you want to do final reviews. And since training is so important, people remember the first thing they see and the last thing they see in many instances. It's all that stuff in the middle that gets kind of lost. That's why you want them engaging and doing activities, because that helps reinforce that other stuff, if you will, in their minds. And so for your final review, you can do similar activities as I've been talking about. Another technique I use similar to the eggs is I put colored balloons around the room, and I put the strips in those, and I have volunteers to go pick one up. And when they pop it, they've added more sound to the room. There's a lot of laughter and fun, and they retrieve their strip of paper, they read it, someone else answers it, etc. Now, I will give you a word of caution. In 45 years of doing this kind of stuff, I've only had one instance that I was just caught totally off guard with, and it was presenting to an ATD group about 2 years ago. I had a woman who walked in the room. I had balloons on the wall. She told the registrar she's leaving. She's deathly allergic to latex. She can't even be in the room. And I'd never heard of such sensitivity. So we quickly took the balloons off the walls, popped them, put them away. And she still left because she said the residue is still in the room. So 1 out of thousands of people had that reaction. So you'll have to play that by ear and decide how you want to handle that. But again, that's just another technique that I use for reviews. Okay, let's talk about the three ways that we get most of our information as adult learners. The first one is visually, and the source for this is at the bottom of the slide. If you want to go learn more about this, you might go check out that book. But her research shows that 40 to 65% of learners are typically visual learners primarily. 25 to 30% are auditory learners, and 5 to 15% are kinesthetic learners. Now, I would caution you about statistics. You know as well as I do probably that if you throw out a statistic, there's going to be somebody in the room who's going to raise their hand and say, I'm sorry, where did you get that? So I would encourage you, for your own credibility, to always have your sources in your lesson plan or always have them available so you can quote them. That would help you gain credibility and maintain credibility with your learners. But again, this source came up with these numbers. I've seen different numbers over the years, as you probably have too. That's why I always throw in the caveat of there are probably other studies that have different findings, but this is an average based on this person's findings or research. Now, speaking of research, I talked about Malcolm Knowles briefly earlier in the adult learning theory, and one of the things that, some of the things that Malcolm found out, as you see here, basically our learners don't buy into that. Someday you'll need this, as we mentioned earlier. They want to know, they want to do it themselves, they want to be engaged, they bring experience with them, they want to use that experience, and ultimately they want to come out of there motivated with ideas of how to learn and how to use those ideas. So whatever you can do in your learning environment, tying in the brain-based research I've sort of overviewed here, I would encourage you to do that. And if you do those things, chances are you're going to have a more effective end result, and people are going to walk out of there saying, well, that was a valuable session. I'm glad I did that, and now I'm going to go back and I'm going to use that in the workplace, just as I hope many of you will do with some of these ideas. And again, if you have questions about any of this, give me a call, shoot me an email, and I'll be happy to talk to you about them and share any resources I have. So how do you tie all this together? Here are three ideas. We sort of mentioned them earlier. Put in challenges. Make people think. Get them to think outside the box. Do team activities. Get them coordinating together. Get them sharing ideas through brainstorming and problem solving, because by doing that, they actually become your co-facilitators. They're teaching things you might not have thought about. They're teaching things that might not have come to their mind. We had a saying when I was a drill instructor back in the 70s. If you can't figure out the answer to a problem, give it to 80 brand new recruits who just came on the island from all different backgrounds and all different cultures and all different knowledge and education levels. Give it to them, walk out of the room for an hour, come back, and they'll have you a couple good answers for it. And I would challenge you to do the same thing with your learners. Let them get involved. Let them solve their own issues. They probably know it. They just haven't got the motivation, or they don't have the competence to try it possibly. So get them to brainstorm and collectively come up with some ideas, and that's an added value in your learning environments. And ultimately, when those people become actively engaged, they're going to walk out feeling good about themselves. They're going to feel good about you. And again, some of the strategies you can use to tie this information in, we've talked about some of them already, but the last one is very important. Get feedback. You need to ask questions periodically. You need to get some input. You need to find out, am I getting through? Those types of things. And if that's something that is your goal, then you can look at all the resources on the internet or look at some of the other things I've talked about or on my website or blog and find ways of doing things differently. Be creative, think outside the box, and ultimately provide your learners with the opportunities to make those associations I've been talking about. If you do that, chances are very good that you're going to walk out with a successful event, and they're going to walk out doing things differently. Use analogies, simulations, jokes, stories, whatever. Just make sure they tie to the learning content. Make sure they point to your learning objectives, because if they don't, you have wasted your time and you have wasted your learner's time throughout that session. And ultimately, that's not something we want to do. So, with that in mind, what questions do you have that I could briefly answer. It looks like we got about 6 or 7 more minutes here. Are there anything that you haven't already typed in? I don't have the ability to scroll back and pick and choose those. As I said, I'll have Henry share that information with me, and I'll go back and find any questions and answer those for each of you later. But is there any additional questions about anything I've talked about that I can just quickly answer for you? If you'll just type that in. Okay, Christy's got a question, it looks like. But I don't see it yet.
Hi, Bob. I have a question here from Katie. How is learning or teaching to young people different than teaching to adults?
Good question. Well, if you go back and look at Malcolm Knowles' descriptions that I pointed out earlier, when you get these slides, that's pretty much the difference. A lot of research has been done that, first of all, they don't have the knowledge or experience or the ability, in some cases, depending on the age limit, to process the information. So I don't want to say you're going to have to dumb it down, but you're going to have to take it down to a more basic level, obviously, when you're sharing information with people at that age group. You're also going to have to keep in mind that they probably are not actively engaged mentally. They've got other things on their mind, like when can we go out for recess, when do we get out of here, that kind of thing. Or who's that cute girl or cute guy sitting over there. And so, just the basic common sense things would come into play there. But if you look at those Malcolm Knowles things, that's a lot of the things that are different. Specifically, one of the things I would suggest, again, is there are a number of resources out there that have books just for teachers. And I think that one of the publishers that does that is called Corwin Press. Corwin, and they have a lot of books on brain-based learning. Go to Eric, type in Eric Jensen on the internet and research him and his organization. The guy's phenomenal. He not only does sessions for adults, for teachers and trainers, but he also used to put on conferences on brain-based learning, and he's got a lot of books out there tied to different things from using music to how does the brain learn, and he's got other resources available out there from other authors as well. So lots of good stuff out there. Hopefully that answered your question, Katie. Okay, we've got a couple of questions here. Looks like they've popped up here. Tips for teaching lawyers, doctors, bankers, etc. That's a good question. And higher education folks too, PhDs and such, they unfortunately in many cases have such structured time schedules, and time is money to them like it is to all of us. But more importantly, they've been there, done that, they think they know everything. So the challenge would be there is do a needs assessment and find out what their specific needs are and address as many of those as possible and get them into work groups. Brainstorming would be my suggestion. Let them come up with ideas in their groups, because chances are the things you come up with, if you're not a doctor or a lawyer or a banker or whatever in those professions, aren't going to specifically target their needs. You can sort of be the conduit. You can provide the structure. You can facilitate the knowledge, but those are the ways I would approach something like that. Henry, I'm not able to read entire comments here because the slides are covering them. I see Donna has a question about any tips for keeping learners something. Can you see what that is?
Bob, there are quite a number of questions about tips on keeping learners engaged when training virtually. So can you speak a little bit about virtual training and virtual classroom?
Yeah, unfortunately, that a lot of times goes back to the platform you have and you plan to use. Luckily, with something like the one we're using here that Saba has, they have the ability for you to clap. They have the ability for you to check yes or no or to raise your hand. You want that kind of platform if at all possible, because you want to be able to interject things. I'm designing an online course with another organization right now with one of my textbooks. And one of the things we're injecting, not only do we have slides, but we have questions or activities for the students to pause the video and to think about or jot down answers to, whatever. And if you have the right platform, they can also respond, such as you're doing here. So it really, again, depends on the technology, but try to build in ways to ask them questions, to get their thoughts. If nothing else, have them, give them your email address and have them as a completion part there to send you questions, and then you can send them back out with answers to everyone who attended the session. It's a really difficult challenge sometimes. If anyone else has any thoughts, if you want to type those in that people can read, that'd be great. And but that's some of the things I would suggest is look at how you're delivering it and think of what ways you can build into your program some question answer type things. The old computer-based learning, if you will, from decades ago, it used to be like a page turner thing, which was horrible, and if you answered the question right, you got to go to the next one. If not, you had to try again, those sort of things. There's still some of that going on, but it's been updated and in different ways, so you can build in those kinds of elements. But again, you want to try to reach out to your learners and engage them. Okay. See a lot of questions popping up here. A lot of them are comments, actually. Do you see anything specifically in the questions there, Henry, that we might address?
Yeah, Bob, there were a lot of questions on the virtual classroom, but it seems like a lot of people are answering the questions within themselves in the chat, so that's great. If you have any more questions for Bob that we might have overlooked, just feel free to type it in again, just because sometimes there are so many comments and chats coming in that we're kind of losing track a little bit. We have about 3 minutes left. I just want to take this time to say that the recording of this webinar will be available to you. We'll send it about 24 hours after the webinar is over. So look out for an email from Saba. And Bob, while we wait here for any last questions coming in through the chat, if you want to go over some more information, now is the time.
Okay. Well, certainly there's a lot of things we can talk about. One of the things that I want to point out, I talked about statistics earlier, and I'd really encourage you to be careful about how you use statistics in your learning, no matter whether you're doing online or doing classroom, because your credibility is at stake, as I mentioned earlier. And there's a couple of examples on of how that has been traditionally misdone, if you will, throughout the years. And you've probably seen statistics the same as I have. How many of you have taught interpersonal communication classes focused on nonverbal communication? Just a quick show of hands on that. Oh, lots of you. Okay. Have you ever quoted Dr. Albert Moravian's statistics that say 7% of message meaning comes from your words, and that your verbal way you communicate basically comes from 55% comes to that. I'm sorry, 37% comes to that, and 55% comes from your nonverbal cues. And a lot of people can misconstrue that to mean that nonverbals don't, the words don't mean anything. That's the furthest thing from the truth. And as a matter of fact, the way people quote those statistics and use them are wrong. I've talked to Albert Moravian, and he's still at UCLA, and if you go to his website, just type in Dr. Albert Moravian and go to his site, he discounts the way people use that research. It was actually a very small study, and it was focused on how two people communicating get the meaning or form an opinion, if you will, about the other person. And I've had people stand in front of classrooms and say, throw out those numbers and say, so when you're designing your programs, keep these in mind. Has absolutely nothing to do with presentations, according to Moravian. And again, if you throw that kind of stuff out and people are knowledgeable about that, they will. I see some old boys, type things popping up here. Those things can get you in trouble and destroy your credibility. There's another one that's been out there for years, and there's a couple of versions floating around I've seen, where if you read something, you for 2 weeks after, you retain only about 10%. It goes up and up and up to 80 or 90%, where if you see and do something, it's 80 or 90%. Well, guess what? Those numbers, nobody knows where they came from, because the original model that came out of came from years ago, back in the 70s, by a guy who, Edgar Dale, who wrote a book on audiovisual methods in teaching. And his original chart and model had no statistics. Somewhere along the line, somebody married those two up, and now you see them floating around, and you see them in books, you see them in whatever. And I got to do a self-disclosure here. I was as ignorant as some of you probably are at this point using those kinds of things, because I've been guilty of using both of those. But about 4 years ago, when I was researching another one of my books, I found variations, and that started making me wonder, well, who's the original source? And when I started tracking these things down, I found those two things. Matter of fact, there's more information about that if you go to my website, www.robertwlucas.com, and click on articles. There's a couple hundred articles there. One of them on that site shows the charts that I'm talking about, and it shows it talks about misuse of statistics and such. And again, that's in the article section of www.robertwlucas.com. Scroll down to the training and development area of those articles, and you'll find establish your credibility to maintain learner respect. And basically, that's what the article is about. Establish your credibility to maintain learner respect. So with that, I am done, and I see we're out of time, and I know some of you are starting to drop off. So thank you very much for your time. You will get copies of the slides and the recording, and I'll answer any questions that came in and send those out to everyone as well. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for attending.
All right, thanks, Bob, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. For more information about SABA and more webinars like this, please feel free to visit saba.com. Thank you.